My friend who passed away many years ago, taught here for a long time, C.W. Smith, used to say, "I never miss chapel. I never go and I never miss it." I can't really use that phrase myself. I'm not godly enough to be that cynical. Let's start off, as we should, with bacon, because bacon is delicious, but that's a different kind of bacon. Sir Francis Bacon: "Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested." This is a man born in 1488 in Spain who understood the importance of books and the power of knowledge and the wisdom and the understanding that can come from reading and from studying at whatever level you are capable and interested in. You can see his signature there on the right, Don Hernando Colón. And he had a little bit of a problem, right? He was brilliant, but his father was also incredibly brilliant. He was pretty famous, in fact, his dad. Was known for going on very long business trips in the late 1400s, early 1500s. His son, his illegitimate son, their parents never married, Hernando, was finally at the age of 13 invited by his father on one of these special business trips. So they got on a boat and sailed across the Atlantic. He was 13. Pretty cool trip for a dad and a son. And that was the last of his father's series of expeditions. His dad had some crazy ideas about how the world was structured, how it worked, and what all that meant. This last expedition ended up as a disaster. There was mutiny and betrayal and storms and starvation. And when they finally got back to Spain, having failed yet again to do what his father wanted to do, his dad kind of got back to Spain. He was a broken man. He was wealthy and he was famous, but he hadn't done what he had hoped he could do. But he was still a hero in his young son, Hernando's eyes, even though his dad never really accomplished the goal that he had set out for himself. Right? Hernando, over the next 25 years of his life, decided he wanted to try to do something as awesome as what his father tried to do that was awesome. He wanted to do something that would leave a mark, that would change things, that would involve a similar kind of thing that his father wanted to do, right? Hernando wanted to build the world's largest library. Now, this is during the Renaissance, where the recovery of knowledge of Greek and Latin texts and ancient things from Persia and the Middle East and North Africa were all, for the first time, you have a generation of people that can read printed books, and books became widely available, and literacy went through the roof, and everybody was reading and learning, right? And for young Hernando, his father's insanely ambitious quest to circumnavigate the globe. His father was Christopher Columbus. Had a dream that wasn't completed by him, but was completed about a quarter century later by the Magellanic expedition. And what Hernando decided to do, if my dad can't sail around the world and understand the structure of things, then what I want to do is to build a library encompassing all of human learning and knowledge. I want to enclose all knowledge in a single library, in one location. In other words, I want to circumnavigate not the globe, but learning, knowledge, understanding, and ultimately wisdom. In a sense, he wanted to imitate his annoyingly famous father, Cristoforo Colombo. And with a father like that, as my students often hear me say, what are you going to do? Hernando traveled extensively. He acquired thousands of books when books were really a brand new thing, right? He got 4,200 books from a trip just to Northern Europe. He traveled to the Middle East and to North Africa. He got books in Greek and Latin and Persian and all of the European tongues. And he got a special collection that he built in Venice, which was really the center of Renaissance printing. He got 1,674 books. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot of books to us, because we can push a button on Amazon and get in a lot of trouble with our credit cards and fill a room with books, right? But this is back when books are fairly new and comparably, at least at the beginning, expensive. And a scholar might own 20 books, and a university library might have 1,000. Hernando got 1,674 books from Venice, which was the center of printing and learning alongside of Florence in northern Italy during the Renaissance. His personal library swelled to somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 volumes, making it the largest collection in Europe, bigger than all the other university libraries, right? And the crowning glory of his collection were his Venetian books, because Aldo Manuzio had figured out how to produce beautiful books, the ancient Greek and Latin classics, and books from Africa, and books from the Middle East, and books from Asia, books about everything, books with pictures and books with text, books of all kinds. And he had his books saved in the individual areas where he collected them. And he hired an army of scholars in order to collect these books and figure out how to organize them. Because if you don't know what a book is or where it is, it doesn't do you a lot of good. One example is the Divina Proporzione, which was written by Luca Pacioli, who on the weekends invented accounting. Right? And he was the teacher of a guy named Leonardo da Vinci and taught him math. And Leonardo and Pacioli believed that mathematically, geometrically, there were certain structures, certain shapes that explained how God had designed the universe. And he had a copy of that book, and it was preserved there in Venice. Right? As Hernando tried to figure out how to store and organize and keep track of books and be able to make them all work together. He's the guy that invented a new way of storing books. People had put books on shelves for a long time, and they would stack them up horizontally, but when you pulled them out, it could be damaging to the binding and so on and so forth. And he said, why don't we stand them up? You learn something new and useless every day if you listen to me talk. He invented vertical bookshelving, right? And he also figured out an intricate system of ordering, organizing, cataloging, and keeping track of all of the books. No one had had to do this before because no one had had that many books, right? He had a volume, a blank, where every book he purchased, where did he get the money for this many books? His father had brought back so much money from the New World that this guy was able to finance a library in the Old World, right? And in a kind of a catalog book, he wrote down the title, the author, the price, who he bought it from, but where he bought it, the date that he bought it from, and a detailed summary of every book. What he wanted to do was to collect every book ever printed and every pamphlet ever printed, and have a summary in a catalog, and he created an absolutely amazing way to put them all together, and he designed a kind of a hieroglyphic sign symbol system in each entry of these thousands and thousands of books, which basically functioned like a kind of hypertext. It was a way to connect all books and therefore all learning. He wanted a person to be able to sit down with his giant volume and to digest many volumes simply by reading the summaries. It's like Wikipedia. What modern scholars say about Hernando is, in some ways, he kind of invented an analog version of the internet over several decades in the beginning of the 16th century, right? They actually have his Libro de los Epitomes, right? An epitome is like a summary. They actually have this volume. Weirdly enough, it's sitting in an archive in Copenhagen. Scholars from all over the world go to look at it because this is a list of all the great books from the Renaissance, with this explosion of learning at the beginning of the modern age. And they would look through and they would read his summaries of books. Some of these books are long lost, and read the hieroglyphics and see how he was trying to make a super connection of all kinds of knowledge, right? They say that what he actually did was to create a brilliant pre-analog internet of books. He created, in essence, the first search engine. He believed that Spain was going to rule the world, and Spain was going to need an oracle of truth that would explain not the structure and the design of everything and the layout and the maps and all of the knowledge that people had figured out about God and man and everything in between, but would become an oracle of truth that would guide mankind into a new golden age. And it would make sense of an often senseless world. Just like his father, Christopher Columbus, he tried to circumnavigate the terrestrial world, and his illegitimate son, Hernando, tried to circumnavigate the world of the sum total of all knowledge. And he was going to collect it. He was going to bring all the collections that were spread all over Europe. He would buy them and collect them and have people work on there. And he was going to, when they were all put together, he was going to bring them home to his home city of Sevilla in Spain and store them in the cathedral there. Pride of place in his collection spread all over Europe as they began to come towards Sevilla were his 1,674 books from Venice, the most important books, the most crucial books, right? It was the knowledge of the world stored there in Venice, the center of Renaissance learning. Decades of work, organized, structured, cataloged, and hyperlinked together. They were all sealed up in barrels, and they set sail for Spain in the fall of 1522. What profit hath man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. I know what you're thinking. Are you saying all of my hard work in Jensen and Halstead and Anderson and Francis and Button is going to end up at the bottom of the sea? And on top of that, the business department will cash all of your tuition checks. Hernando Colón's prized possession, the Venetian collection, went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Decades of work, unspeakable amounts of money, incredible labor, reading all those books, cataloging them, and finding the structure of knowledge that wove them all together in a web of understanding. Hernando was devastated. Decades of labor under the sea. Just a few years later, he died, leaving what remained of his library, most of which had made its way to the Cathedral of Sevilla, leaving what remained of his library and his book, the Epitome, the collection that summarized everything, to his only surviving relative, a young nephew who was illiterate and a drunk and a gambler, and saw the collection of books not as a library containing the sum of human wisdom and knowledge, but as a bank account from which he could make regular withdrawals to finance his bad habits. Over the next 5 centuries, the library was housed in a forgotten attic in the cathedral. The roof leaked. Children from all over the city knew about the library and would sneak into the cathedral to look at the pictures in the book and often steal them. Between half a millennium of thieves, mold, water, damage, and rats, the collection was virtually destroyed. Hernando's guidebook, connecting the thousands of volumes of the restored classical knowledge of the Renaissance and everything else, was now a sort of hyperlinked index to a mass of information that for the most part was now lost in the mist of time. It was an index without a book, so to speak, a compass in a world without true north. Every day for 5 years, as a brand new Christian, about 40 years ago, I carried this tiny Bible. It's so small I can't even read the print anymore. And I became obsessed with the book of Ecclesiastes. And I want to ask you to open your Bibles now. It's kind of weird, isn't it? The hardest book of the Bible is the one that if you just open it up randomly in the center, there it is, staring you in the face. I remember trying to understand the book of Ecclesiastes. And people would just say, son, don't read that. I worked on a dairy farm. Every day I cleaned out with a big shovel 400 stalls. And I'd come back the next morning at 6 a.m. and the cows had refilled the stalls. And I remember reading, what profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? 22 years ago, I taught a class on Ecclesiastes. It lasted about 18 months. And I'm now going to give you a highly distilled version of what I learned. I've had students come up to me for years and say, I know that Ecclesiastes is your favorite book of the Bible. Why? And can you tell me what it means? And I tell them, I don't have an answer to either one of those questions. Not really. But I can't stop reading it. So let's see what wise King Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes. In chapter 1, verse 3. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? Right before that, he starts off with another winner of a line. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Right? That's not a verse you read in the middle of doing a wedding ceremony. This is depressing. And people have said for years, for centuries, for millennia about Ecclesiastes, how can it be so beautiful but so depressing at the same time? And I think one of those interpretations is right and the other is wrong. The question is, how do you figure this out? And when Solomon looked at the world, in verse 4, he says, one generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hasteth to its place where it rose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about into the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Now, this is not a particularly unusual set of observations. You can read the pagan Greek and Latin classics and find the same things. People are struggling with the fact that in observable reality, there are kind of two ways to view the world. One is that everything is kind of fixed. There are patterns that occur regularly, right? Water runs down the river into the sea, and somehow or another it ends up back in the mountains of snow, and then it runs back down and goes around, and the wind goes around, and one generation comes and another one goes away. And the same things seem to be happening over and over again. There's a pattern, there's a fixity. And some people take that to an extreme and say that means that somehow or another the world is ruled by fate. And that's one way to look at it. And other people look at the world and say, yeah, but a lot of times those patterns break and it seems unpredictable. And everything seems to be filled with chance and contingency. And don't we have free will after all? And it becomes a world of randomicity. And those two worldviews are very common in almost every culture. Solomon is observing the same thing. But what you can say about whether the world is fixed and fatalistic and determined, or whether you believe that the world is contingent based on chance because of human freedom and the unpredictability of nature, one conclusion that all of us can come to is that the world is absolutely unfair. It is unjust. Either it is fatally unjust or it is freely unjust. And this becomes a central problem in the book. He says in verse 9, the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. Verse 11, watch this. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. You understand what he just said? He said, there are things that haven't happened yet. and generations that have not yet been born. And there are things that they will do, and they are already forgotten by people who are not yet here. There are things that haven't happened yet, and they're already forgotten. The bottom of the sea. You have no hope. You want to leave a mark? Every mark is erased. You want to build a library? It'll probably go to the bottom of the sea. It's not very happy. Solomon, in chapter 2, verse 21, says, "For there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity." There are people who spend their lives with books and ideas and labs and numbers and math and science and philosophy and art and literature and history. There are people who that's what they do. Yet to a man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it for his portion. Sometimes I wonder when I'm sitting in my library over in my study on North Campus, who's going to get my books? All of my kids and their spouses are readers, and I'm pretty sure all my grandkids are going to be readers. Are they going to fight over them? They're not going to care? Who's going to get my books? Who's going to get my stuff? In chapter 3, Solomon says in verse 11, He hath made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has set the world in their heart. A better translation, there would be eternity, right? So that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. At the beginning of Ecclesiastes, Solomon says, I decided to study everything. I wanted to learn everything I could and to understand everything and to come to some kind of conclusion that would bring satisfaction to my soul. Not just the pleasure of ownership and consumption. Those are great. But I wanted to understand the world. And he says, everything that is made is beautiful. Everything God made is good, and it's all beautiful. And God has put eternity in their hearts. He has built in all of us a sense of our own immortality. None of us can really imagine not being. Right? If you go back to chapter 1, in verse 13, Solomon says this directly. I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. What did Solomon major in? Everything. This severe travail, great 17th century phrase, hard work, severe travail, hard work. This hard work God has given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. God says, you want to live in my world without me. Okay. And he just backed away and said, try and figure it out. You have the index. You don't have the book. Solomon says in chapter 3, verse 18, another one of these heartwarming verses. I said in my heart, concerning the estates of the sons of men, that God might test them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. When you bring it down to brass tacks, all of us tend to function like animals. And like animals, we all die. If you were to jump ahead to chapter 7, Solomon says this in verse 10. And here's a great... Now, when you read Ecclesiastes, it's weird. It's not like a straightforward narrative. It's not some kind of systematic theology. It's a bunch of strange proverbs mixed in with some depressing observations and a few little bits of hope that pop up here and there. But most of it just seems, Chapter 7, verse 10, here he gives us some very wise instruction. This is not an easy lesson to learn. I've been trying to learn it for 4 decades. I don't have it down. Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? This is what all old people say. I'm not old yet, so I don't say it, but all old people, well, come things ain't like they used to was, right? Right? Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. It's not that things weren't better back then. Maybe they were. It's not that things aren't worse now. Maybe they are. right? The problem is inquiring why. He says something very closely related to that, and then he throws in a couple of Proverbs, but he says something very close to that, starting in verse 13. So jump down a few verses. Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? That's disturbing. And then verse 14. Verse 14 is the commentary on verse 10 and the solution to the problem of verse 13. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. God gives you a lot. Have a party. Be thankful. Enjoy all the things he gives you, materially and spiritually. Enjoy that. God wants you to enjoy that. He's good. He's gracious. He's kind. He's generous. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider. When things are hard, stop and think. God also hath set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. He will send you adversity, and he will give you prosperity, and he will mix those days up in a blender. And he wants you to be thankful when there is plenty, and he wants you to stop and think when things are hard. Because he wants to leave you, as the phrase is, man should find nothing after him. He wants to leave you in a place where you know you can't count on anything. Everything you have can go to the bottom of the sea in an instant. And Solomon keeps saying, like he says in verse 25 in this chapter, right? I applied my heart to know. He was a diligent student of life, and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things. He wants to know, how does it work? How does it work? What's happening in the world? How is it structured? Is it designed? Is it random? Is it fixed? Can we predict things? Because if the world is random, you can't predict anything. And how can you live? And if the world is fixed, if it's a fatalistic world, a stoic world, a materialistic, mechanistic world, then what hope do you have to change anything? You want to look at the world and say it doesn't need to be changed? There's a whole lot of people in the philosophical world and in the political world that say, there's problems with the world. There's a lot of problems, and they need to be changed. They need to be fixed. Those observations are often very correct. And Solomon wants to understand that. And in chapter 8, verse 1, he says something that I think kind of brings us maybe to the crux of Ecclesiastes. He asks a series of rhetorical questions. Who is as the wise man? And who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. Now, I teach in the English department, I run the CLA program, and I do some other stuff with art and things like that, right? And everything I do professionally involves interpretation. Here's the thing, what does it mean? What does Michelangelo's David mean, right? What does Anna Karenina mean? What does this sonnet mean? What does this philosophical or political idea or theory mean? This is what Solomon's trying to get to. What does it mean? What does it mean? Well, what do you mean when you say, what does it mean? What is the meaning of meaning? What does it mean? And when he says, who knows the interpretation of a thing, what he's doing is he's saying, do any of us really know what it all means, what it all together means? That's what Hernando Colon was trying to do, was to somehow or another link together to kind of hypertext, to make a super kind of an AI analog version from which you could distill the sum of human learning and understand everything. He says, a man's wisdom, his knowledge, maketh his face to shine. Ain't nobody got a shinier face than that someone that just had their PhD doctoral hood put on by their advisor. And the boldness, and another way to translate that might be arrogance. The arrogance of his face shall be changed, right? You see, as has been said, by Sir Francis Bacon. A little philosophy may incline a man to atheism, but deep study brings you to a knowledge that there is something more. Over time, study should remove the arrogance from your face and leave you humble. It often does not. He tells us a little bit later on in chapter 8, go down to verse 14. There is a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there are just men unto whom it happeneth according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happeneth according to the work of the righteous. I say that this is also vanity. He says, there seems to be no sense, no rhyme or reason, no real justice in the world. Now, Solomon is probably, writing to teach people around him, perhaps his own children. I think that's a fair assumption. He's also, I think, writing to himself as an old man, because at the end of Ecclesiastes he said, I wrote a lot of Proverbs, and I wrote a lot of songs and a lot of poems, and I did all this. So I think as an old man he's looking back and reflecting, and he's trying to give you a distilled version of what he's learned over his life. And one of the things he's learned is that sometimes when you do well, it sure looks like you're being punished. And sometimes when you do badly, it looks like you're rewarded. In other words, he's asking that tough question, God, if you're out there, what kind of job do you think you're doing running the world? That's the question. That's the question. And he says in verse 17, then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. Because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, further, though a wise man think he know it, yet shall he not be able to find it. No book is ever finished. No art is ever completed. Only abandoned, as Leonardo da Vinci says. No art is ever completed, only abandoned. No philosophical construct solves the problem it sets out to solve. No political theory, left, right, center, whatever. They never can solve the problems that they set out to solve. They can't do it. Knowledge seems in many cases to lead mostly to despair. It's terrifying. And it doesn't get better, right? In chapter 9, he says in verse 3, there is an evil, a bad thing, among all things that are done under the sun, that there is one event unto all, because everybody dies. Yea, also, the heart of the sons of men is full of evil, and madness, insanity is in their heart while they live, and after that they go to the dead. Well, that's wonderful. You're crazy, you're miserable, then you die. This guy didn't get invited to a lot of parties. Injustice everywhere. Verse 11 in chapter 9. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill. But time and chance happeneth to them all. And chance is really not a good translation there in the 17th century. It would really be time and events, because I don't think Solomon believes in chance. All of us experience events, and a lot of them are quite adverse. He has a beautiful line in chapter 11 and verse 5, one of my favorite verses in the Old Testament. As thou knowest not what is the way of the wind. No one really understands how the wind works, especially back then, nor how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child. How do hard bones form in a baby inside of a woman's belly? And we know about how calcium gets together and forms bones. Okay, we understand biologically. But do we really know? Even so thou knowest not the works of God who maketh all. All of us are ultimately ignorant of God and his works. So what kind of advice is this guy going to be? We're almost out of chapters here, and we're almost out of time. What kind of advice is he offering here? Well, chapter 11, verse 9. Rejoice. How am I supposed to do that? Well, let's see. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth. Enjoy it while it lasts. And let thy heart cheer thee on the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. So do your thing. But know that for all these things, God will bring thee into judgment, because God owns you. He made you in his image. He loves you, but he hates your sin, and he will bring you into judgment. Verse 10, therefore, remove sorrow from thy heart. Try and undepress your depression. And put away evil from thy flesh. You want to know how to stop being sad? Try cutting down on the sin. Works every time. Put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. And in chapter 12, verse 12, every scholar's favorite verse of the Bible, even if they don't believe in the Bible, right? 12:12. Further, by these, my son, be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and much study is weariness of the flesh. I'm working on my 7th book right now. I still got to finish some things on the 6th one. The 5th one's not yet to the publisher. I'm never going to get it done. And if I do, it's just going to end up at the bottom of the sea. He'll be forgotten, just like me. Let us hear, verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. You see, here's the problem. He doesn't tell us what it all means. He tells us to fear God and obey him. This doesn't solve the problem for me. It is the problem for me, because I do not fear God and I do not keep his commandments. And therefore, I am adrift in a world unmoored from meaning itself. I and you and all human beings constantly experience the painful disorientation of being unable to interpret the world in any truly, continually satisfying way. And we are left floating in a foundationless, hermeneutic, interpretive vacuum where we try this way and that way to achieve some kind of grounded satisfaction, what a great psychologist called self-actualization. Just being you and being comfortable and good with that and being happy and satisfied and whole. But we can't get that satisfaction and we can't get that comfort. Living fallen in a fallen world is like having the index without the book, whose pages are now rolling in the abyssal sand at the bottom of the sea. So how in the world can we possibly reconcile whether the world is fixed or contingent, whether it's fatalist, mechanistic, or free? How do we deal with the problem of injustice? How do we live moment by moment? Like everything else in Christian theology, the solution, where absolute injustice in a world that appears utterly random and terribly fatalistic is the moment of Christ on the cross. The one who owed no debt but pays all debt. The one who did not deserve death, dying. The one who was God himself, somehow rejected momentarily by his own Father God. Every problem is resolved in the cross. I actually have a 17th century writer whose prose I like more than John Milton's. Sir Thomas Browne, an Anglican doctor in the 17th century. And here's what he says. That which is the cause of my election, God calling me out, saving me, I hold to be the cause of my salvation, which was the mercy and beni placet, the good pleasure of God. God chose me and saved me because he wanted to. It gave him pleasure to love me. Before I was, or the foundation of the world. Before Abraham was, I am, is the saying of Christ. Yet is it true in some sense if I say it of myself. For I was not only before myself, I not only existed before I existed, but before Adam existed. But Adam, that is, in the idea of God and the decree of that synod held from all eternity. And in this sense, I say, the world was before the creation. And the world was at an end before it had a beginning. And thus was I dead before I was alive. Though my grave be in England, my dying place was paradise. And Eve miscarried of me before she conceived of Cain. That's it.